We'll go live in 20 seconds. I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if it shows you. All right. Well, what's up, everyone? It's Channing, and we have a special edition episode this week of the Louisiana Homebuyer Podcast. And I got my main man, Mr. Brad LaComb with Southern Title. What's up, Brad?
What's going on, Channing? Good to see you, man. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. I'm happy to have you on. We've been trying to coordinate this for a while, and just schedules and whatnot. So excited to do this. For those of you that don't know, Brad is the owner of Southern Title and Escrow in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And they do a lot of different things that Brad's going to talk about, but primarily what we use them for is for the title work on purchases and refinances. So I think what we'll share a little bit about today. So for those of you who want to stay tuned, I think Brad's got some great stories about the importance of what they do. And we'll dive a little bit into that as far as the ins and outs on why why you're paying for this and what all that means, and the importance of all that. So if you want to stay tuned to the end, we will definitely get into that. But without further ado, man, what is going on and what's on your heart to share today?
Well, first off, again, thank you for having me, Channing. Good to see you. Just wanted to come on here. I love the way that you provide value and education to agents and different people in the real estate sector. So wanted to link up with you to join in on that, to see what kind of value I provide. As you mentioned, we're on the title side. We're generally kind of not seen and hopefully not heard from in a lot of instances until we're calling everybody to come to the table and finish everything. So, but we do play a role in that. A lot of times it is behind the scenes in just clearing and making sure, you're paying the right person for the property that you think you're buying, and to advise of any issues or any kind of servitudes or things like that you're buying the property subject to. So it's a bit of a puzzle. You got to find the enjoyment in it. It takes a special kind of person, so to speak, because we essentially just read through courthouse records for the majority of the day.
And look for problems, right?
Correct. Well, and a lot of people would read through that and be asleep by about the third document in, because it's not, a novel reading or anything like that. It's pretty dry, pretty boring, pretty monotonous, but
still very important.
Correct.
Yeah. So the worst thing ever would be to buy a house and then have someone's cousin come out of the woodworks and say, "Hey, I actually own that house," right?
Or I own
an ex-wife or whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were talking
before we started, and I said, a lot of people, so when you're buying a house, for those of you who've bought, you'll understand this. If you haven't, there's this document, it's called a loan estimate. And what it does is it highlights all the fees that you pay when you buy a house. Well, Brad is part of the fees that you're going to see on that. And for the most part, I feel like people don't really know why they're there. They're just like, oh, I've got to pay that. And then, you guys will communicate with them closer to the end. And, especially if they have questions about title insurance and stuff like that. But until then, they don't really always know. So it's good though, because it's insurance, right? At the end of the day, that's what it is. That's what you're buying. And so you're protecting yourself from the potential for something to happen. And also making sure, like you said, that whoever is selling this home actually has the legal right to do so.
Correct. It is, in most instances, it is an insurance policy that we are providing. Like all insurance, better to have and not need than need and not have. So that's one of the things and we'll get into it as we talk, but just trying to educate people on the differences of the lender's title insurance versus the owner's title insurance, who they protect, what they protect, how to read a commitment, how to read an insurance policy, things like that, pointing out some of these things, especially for the non-savvy buyer. Maybe, most people buy 1, 2, maybe 3 homes in their life. And so all of this is new when they go through it. So just making sure you take the time with them, educate them, and make sure that they understand.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that we've, it's kind of, Brad, I don't know how long you've been doing it. I know it's been a while. I've been doing this since 2015. More recently, it seems like I'm seeing more and more issues on the seller side with like title and stuff like that. whether it's just a function of the economy that we're in, or what it is. Are you noticing that, or is it just unique to me?
So I tend to see it in waves.
Yeah.
I have noticed a lot the last year to 2 years. It seems like the tougher deals are kind of coming in, and there are more issues coming up. But I'll tend to see it in waves. Sometimes I'll read through 15, 20 titles, and there's no real issues. It's going pretty smoothly, and then I'll
Yeah.
run into one, and I can kind of see it. The next one I touch will have some issues. The next one I touch. So, but I do see a lot of issues. Some of the more common ones being successions, which you kind of
Yeah.
referred to earlier, where making sure that those were all the proper heirs or potential heirs were identified, accounted for, and that the proper property was properly passed down through those proceedings.
Yeah.
Routinely we deal with right-of-way issues. That's another common one we see, especially when someone who tried to subdivide property or split up property that's not familiar with the process,
Mm.
and maybe doesn't go through and check the right boxes, doesn't
Yeah.
make sure certain things. A lot of time we'll see it with family land, where
Yeah.
initially someone owned a bigger piece and they started selling out to this son and this daughter, and then ultimately when they sell out to a third party outside of the family, it creates issues,
Yeah.
essentially from the title insurance side. So
Especially if like the parent who actually owned the land has passed on or something like that.
correct.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to those succession issues we were talking
Yeah.
about, really making sure that they were, accounted for, and those right to control that was passed down. So,
Yeah,
um,
and just a minute on secessions. This isn't about that, but that isn't something, right, that happens quickly. So like if it's not done like prior to you putting the home up for sale, it is a process that can take some time, right?
correct. And it is, you have to go through that process. There are certain exceptions that allow that to be expedited somewhat. But you do have to wait certain time limits. You do have to make certain filings, and it's not something that, if you're in the deal where you find it out 2 weeks before closing, oh hey, by the way, this has to, we have to get a succession done. Well, that's not happening in 2 weeks. That's not a
Yeah.
2 week process. It's generally going to take some time, and it's time to start getting some extensions signed on the contracts around
Yeah.
that.
So if someone's not sure about their property, is that something that they can ask you about, or does that typically not going to take place until you're like in the process?
So we get those calls pretty often. I'm actually working on a couple now where people just want to know what they own. They
Yeah.
want to just have the examination done. It can be something that a seller can use as a negotiating tool. That title work has already been done. We know it's
Yeah.
clear. Um, Generally, if the way I counsel people is if they are planning on selling that property, they can do it to use it as that bargaining tool, but they are incurring an expense that otherwise would be borne by the potential
The
buyer. And
Got
so,
it.
but as long as they're comfortable with that, an abstract and a search, depending on where and how complicated, is fairly inexpensive. So to do that, especially if you are up against succession issues, if mom owned this property and she passed, and we're trying to sell it as daughter, you need to make
Yeah.
sure you get that lined out really before you get into a contract, because it's only going
Yeah.
to cause frustration on the buyer side if they have to delay it later.
Yeah, and potentially in the contract, right?
Correct.
Because they're not able to fulfill their end of the deal there. So,
Correct.
um, yeah, so I guess it's a good time because a lot of people always want to ask, and we do our best to explain, but then we always point them to you guys with the title insurance. Um, they see the lender's title insurance and then the owner's title insurance, on the LE, it's like way over here in a corner, hidden somewhere.
Yep.
And it has the word optional on it, which I don't like, but
Yep.
not because we don't want people to choose, but it's just like, it's such a inexpensive protection. But let's talk a little bit about that. And so people are like, what? Obviously, title insurance is important if the lender's carrying it for themselves. Because if it wasn't important, they wouldn't be doing it for themselves. But on the flip side of that, that policy, right? It's not protecting the client, it's
Correct.
protecting the lender.
Correct. It protects the lender from any losses they could potentially sustain as a result of certain title issues, encumbrances, that kind of thing. There's a separate policy that, as you mentioned, is referred to as optional, but that's the policy that actually protects the individual owner for the monies that they've put into the property up to that policy limit.
Yeah.
good thing about that policy is it's not like most insurances where it's renewed yearly. It's a one-time fee. You pay it, as you mentioned, when you buy it in conjunction with the lender's policy. There is a simultaneous issue credit that's given to you, so it greatly reduces the cost that you'd otherwise have
Cost.
to pay for it. And it protects you for the lifetime of the time that you own the property. So if you go to sell that property in 10 years or 5 years or whatever the case may be, and they're giving you issues saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to clear the title, well, you
Mm.
can be recouped for those expenses if it was something that was, a problem prior to the time that you got that policy. To touch on the importance of the lender's policy, as you mentioned, there's recently been a big push in the Northeast in Washington for people to, I think, for the government-backed loans to try to eliminate the need for title insurance on a lot of those loans,
Hmm.
which would have greatly impacted, obviously, the title insurance industry.
Yeah.
And that was, a big debate. It had been up there for quite some time, and just recently, it was ruled against, saying that no, this product is important enough that we need to make sure, for the protection of the individual consumers and the protection of the lenders, as well as the government, that they
Yeah.
need to maintain this lender's policy on any loan that's going to be government backed or sold. So it is very important. Again, better to have it, need it, than need it, not have it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
Well, and people will say, "Oh,
that
well, why am I paying for this if it's protecting the lender? Why doesn't the lender cover this?" Well, because you're asking the lender for money, right? And so, at the end of the day, if they were to get rid of it, like you said was being suggested, that policy, the premium isn't going to go away. It's just going to be rolled into your rate because now you've increased the risk for the lender.
exactly, it's all going to be based on a risk analysis on their end.
Yeah. Which is what insurance is, right? It's all about risk analysis. So, is there a feature? I've heard this before, and is there a feature in the owner's policy where it can actually be passed down to heirs if they inherit the property as well, or does it need
So,
to restart when it passes through?
if you're selling it, generally any third party conveyance needs to be, they need a new owner's policy. If it's previously insured under an owner's policy and it's passed down through inheritance, I believe there's a potential that the heir could, still exert the same rights under the policy.
Gotcha. And on the owner's policy, I mean, we do loans generally in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. I've rarely seen them over $1,000. They're usually a few $100. Is that
So it's a percentage of the insured amount. So generally, when you're working with a lender and you're doing it together,
simultaneous? Yeah.
yeah, the policy is issued off the loan amount, and then there's a simultaneous issue where it essentially costs you about $100 or $200 to add on the owner's policy.
Yeah.
If it's separate, just as a standalone product, say in a cash deal, or a transaction where a lender is not involved, then it is generally just going to be a percentage of the sales price. To give you a rough ballpark, at about 150,000, it's probably about $750 to insure that
Gotcha.
amount.
So about a
Um,
0.5% for every 150,000 or so.
Roughly. Now, I think that the more it goes up, it's not, exactly to the
Right.
T, but it's a graduated scale where, and we could always give you a quote if you have a purchase price, you have a property address, call in advance. Hey, what's the amount going to be on this owner's policy for this property, and we can get that
Yeah.
to you.
So you're talking about something that's very, very cheap to protect you from something that would be very, very expensive to deal with on your own, because it's not just the issue itself. You now need legal representation, right? A lot
Correct.
of times when these types of issues come up, which attorneys don't work for free. I'm not sure if y'all knew that, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's kind of a no-brainer.
Correct. I mean, it's and it's not just one issue it's protecting you against, right? It's any issues that come up during the lifetime of the time you own the property that would be
Yep.
covered by the policy. They would provide that representation, and they would, deal with any covered claims under that. So if you have a right of way issue that comes up one time, and then an ownership issue or something like that, then it wouldn't. It's not a one, use it and lose it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's awesome. Um, So I know you probably have some stories that kind of maybe drive this point home. If you want to share something that comes to mind.
Yeah, I've had a few, one of the ones that I always refer back to is we had this was several years back, but we had someone who was trying to sell their property to their child. They were kind of downsizing. Son was starting a family, wanted to kind of take over the family house, and so they were just selling it to him, and we're going to go move into something a little smaller. And so we do some title work, and we go back, as the state law requires, and we find an old judgment from about, I think it was 2 owners prior. I'll say the details on how it still was there, but long story short, it's still attached to that property and had never been cleared, despite a couple of out of town people reviewing title on refinances, but not going back the way as far as they should have. And ended up that in order to sell the property to her son, we had to deal with, I want to say it was like a $10,000 judgment against someone who she didn't even know or was not involved with.
Wow.
Now we were able to negotiate that down a little bit and get it worked out. But had she had an owner's policy, make that claim, she can move on, and she's made whole. So that's one instance that really jumps out. Is just because it was removed, and she didn't think there was any way that would happen, and unfortunately, and we have to be the ones to break that news. So as I said earlier at the beginning of the chat, was usually unseen and hopefully not heard from is
Right.
the title industry.
Right. Yeah, when you call, it's like, oh, be good news, be good news.
Right. Yeah. Sure, some realtors have or loan officers have my number kind of pop up. Oh, here we go. But
I know in the past, like, I encountered an issue, and you probably see this a fair amount. Like, they had a lien still on the property, and it had passed through. It had only been sold a few years back. They missed it, and the bank was like, they went out of business in the housing crash.
Okay.
So like I just remember, I think we ended up getting the deal done, but it was very difficult because you have this uncanceled lien and you have no bank to go back to and say, please remove this or figure it out.
Yeah, that can be the nightmare scenario. We do routinely run into pre-existing liens. I've got a couple files I'm working through now, and it gets difficult when the lien is against a party who's not part of this transaction. It was from a previous owner, because that person has no motivation to participate or to help in any way, and
If you can even find them.
Right. And we're having to contact, different judgment holders, and they're hesitant to provide us with information about that because we're not that person. So it can definitely get complicated on the canceling of old liens. As you mentioned earlier, with the time when it comes to successions, sometimes, tracking down these people, hopefully finding them, dealing with some of the larger lenders to get them to act and cancel something and release a right can be, complicated and time consuming as well. And so, at the end of the day, we are definitely working as best we can to get them canceled or to get the problem fixed. But sometimes there's just a process you have to go
through. A lot of moving parts that you have to rely on, and it can be a mess.
That's it.
Are you seeing, so I think about a year ago, I heard about this, and this was local too, where, so what I want to talk about is the rise of like title fraud. So I think even locally, there was a situation where a piece of property was sold. And the owner had no idea, like they were out of the country. And so it was just like an investment property here, and they come back 3 years later and they no longer own their property. And they had no idea.
Right. So again, that would be something, due to the fraud, that would be something that had that buyer that bought that property, purchased the policy, they would have been made whole on that. That thing I will say. Fraud in the seller fraud has had an uptick. We have received different notices from the different title insurance underwriters that we work with, advising of some of the more common fraudulent activity or attempted fraudulent behavior. But our industry is ripe with that. Title companies are routinely targets of fraud and scams or attempted scams because of the amount of money we deal with. We have substantial amount of funds.
You're talking about wire fraud now, like with
correct wire fraud. But so we got to be on guard against various types of fraud, and that's usually done by independently verifying telephone numbers, calling people, making sure we speak to them directly. just watching out for the red flags. And as I said, our underwriters do a good job of keeping us up to date with kind of the more current trends in that
Yeah.
regard.
Well, and for those of you that are watching that don't know, like what happens a lot of times with this wire fraud is that money is immediately sent overseas, and then most of the time you never see it again.
Yeah.
And I have family members in law enforcement that deal with this on a daily basis, and it's tough, but it is out there, right? So just make sure when you're going through this process that you definitely don't wire anything without double, triple, quadruple checking where it's going, because they will get you.
Yep. Yep. And we have a policy of making sure that, we don't take people calling and say, hey, can you wire my funds here? Like, we make you sign and get a
Yeah.
notarized actual document, mainly for their protection. Sometimes it can complicate, the logistics at the end of it, but it's for their protection because
Right.
there's been stories locally, I believe several years back, where, someone closed, and right after they walked out, that someone gets an email of, hey, I know you were supposed to cut me a check, but go ahead and send the funds here. And it can definitely, so.
Wow. Yeah, that's tough stuff. We used to advise all of our clients before this really heated up to wire funds to title, just because from a lender perspective, it's a lot easier on the documentation on
Mhm.
what they have to provide to the lender. But we've stopped doing that because it's just not worth the risk. Like, I'd rather get all your bank statements than have you lose 12 grand,
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, um, man, so I know you also said, so we'll kind of transition here. You had mentioned some of the more creative things that y'all were doing, and just kind of like the creative financing. And I assume when we talked about that, what you mean is like, uh, do you mean like lease purchases or things like that? Yeah.
We're starting to see that a little more, just because people are trying to facilitate deals, trying to get creative. So we do see a little bit more on the owner financing side, or at least attempts to owner finance. Now,
Yeah.
you can just by listening to this, you may have a couple of reels pop up on your Facebook ad that'll talk about wholesaling and different things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can go into the ins and outs of several different of those options, but we have started to see an uptick in, the main ones we deal with are vendors liens or bond for deeds, where
Mhm.
bond for deed being more like a lease to own kind of thing, vendors lien being more like the seller acting as the bank. But
Okay.
there are certain conditions with that. You do have to be on the lookout for that. I referred to those reels you'll see where, oh yeah, it doesn't matter if someone has a mortgage on it. You can just sign it over to me and I'll just hold on. Yeah, those don't work. That's
Yeah. The bank will usually call the note, right?
right.
That's usually what happens.
Yeah, and that's the main pitfall in doing that. So you always have to be weary of that. Don't enter into anything like that. And a lot of the closings we do, there's a document that says, look, if you ever sell this property, let someone else take out their own mortgage. You pay out your own mortgage and get it canceled.
Yeah.
And handle their own. And so people will try what they can. Some of them are okay. Some of them are clear to do, but some of the wholesale or the pocket deeds, as they'll
Yeah.
call it, those are you're going to have probably a rough time finding someone to kind of facilitate that for you, at least in our local market. I know a lot of the
I was
title.
trying to say Louisiana is so different, right, than a lot
Yeah.
of other states when it comes to our legal system. So,
Yeah, yeah, but
um,
we have done several of the vendors liens, and it just takes a little bit extra legwork and working through the details on what happens if it's a total loss, if there's down payments involved, that kind of thing. Bond for deeds, same, because title's not transferring. You have to worry about who's going to pay insurance, who's going to pay taxes, when you have
yeah.
to reverse, that kind of thing. But as long
So
as you have lines of communication, people understand what they're getting into. You can work those things out as well.
so bond for deed, and obviously we don't do this because I'm a mortgage broker, so
Right.
that kind of cuts me out of it. But uh, bond for deed is more like that lease to own, where there's would you say that it's less risk on the seller's part and more risk on the buyer's part, or is it
Correct.
yeah,
Yeah. So you're not really getting any equity. You're not buying into anything. You're essentially entering into a contract to have the right to buy that house.
yeah,
As long as you do what you're supposed to, they'll later have to sell it to you.
yeah,
But if you don't do what you're supposed to during the term of that agreement,
they
what you
can take
pay
it away.
forfeited, right? That's
Yeah.
that's given over. It's not bought into any equity. They don't owe you any money back. And the eviction proceeding is just that. It's an eviction proceeding as opposed
Yeah.
to foreclosure proceeding. So,
And that's what you would pretty much have to do, though, if you had a mortgage on the property, because the
correct,
vendor's lien, you can't transfer title
correct,
typically, at least without approval from your bank to do so.
exactly.
Um, but that one is more set up like a true financing where maybe you facilitate your payments to a third party or whatever the case may
Right.
be.
You have a promissory note attached to it. You lay out the terms. Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Yep.
Anything else you want to share, man? We're about 25 minutes in, so we're right around that 30-minute mark we talked about.
Yeah. The only other thing that I have kind of written down here is something that we had mentioned, routine title issues or problems that we see or
Yeah.
things commonly dealing with is with regard to tax sale property. I don't know how much you've done with tax sale. If you're a lender, you probably haven't lent on too much tax sale property just because
Yeah.
it's tough to insure. It presents specific issues from a constitutionality standpoint, which means they don't go away with the passage of a certain amount of time, like a lot of other issues in the title industry.
Gotcha.
And so, anytime we're dealing with tax sales, a lot of people, you'll see investors buying them up at tax sales and then wanting to, build a duplex or something like that on them. And they run into an issue when they start trying to get that title insurance. When a bank's lending money and a bank wants that title insurance, there's additional boxes that need to be checked, and the tax sales can cause problems with that. So if you're buying tax sale, if you're in that arena, you need to be very careful and get with a real estate attorney. You may need to do quiet title actions. You may need to do some research to try to locate some people to get them to sign some quick claim deeds in order to make sure. Even though the city or the parish may have sold it to you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's insurable from a title insurance standpoint. So,
Got it.
just
So yeah,
something.
so basically someone buys a house from a sheriff's sale or something like that. What you're saying is that doesn't necessarily mean there's not been a secession or some other type of issue, that because the parish is not guaranteeing that the property is
Correct.
good.
But the bigger issue in tax sale is with regard to the tax sale itself and making sure that the person who lost it actually got notified of the
I see.
property. And
I
so
see.
a lot of the suit records for those things don't have those sheriff's returns in there. There's not a lot of information in them. And if you can't prove they got it by the signed
Wow.
return,
Because then that gives them the legal right to maybe come back and
upset,
get the property back
correct,
on a legality.
or their heirs, because
I
that's
gotcha.
doesn't go away with the 10 years. And so it just, it causes a lot of issues that you wouldn't otherwise think would be present.
And if they lost their home, the chances of them wanting to cooperate with you on a title issue are pretty small.
Yeah. Sometimes we've cleared some people, need to be incentivized in order to do that.
Yeah.
Some people are willing to cooperate. They understand that, they may live in a different state at this point and have no interest in the property. So it's not a big deal to them. But it's case by case, you never really know until you start peeling away the layers.
Yeah. So are you seeing more investments than maybe you used to, like deals and stuff like that, or is it about the same?
I would say the last 3 months, I've definitely seen an uptick in the amount of just cash deals that I'm working. And so a lot of those tend to be investor deals. So I am seeing kind of, more of, I guess, a higher ratio of that. I wouldn't say more just because the market conditions as opposed to the last couple of years, but I would say ratio wise compared to what I was seeing, that ratio has gone up of cash deals to finance deals.
I was just curious because it seems like on the lending side, a lot of lenders are pivoting into more on the investment side of things with non-QM products. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is they're very competitive right now. And so like when you look at a DSCR loan or you look at some of these non-QM, whether it's a bank statement or something like that, the rate isn't that much more than a traditional product, right? And so they don't have to provide the traditional documentation. So I have I try to keep up on what other lenders are doing because it's usually, especially big lenders, because they usually have economists and stuff on staff and they can see things that we don't see. So I was just curious if locally, if you felt like there was a rise in people scooping up investments. I know here too, it's a little because of Laura, like there's obviously a lot of people buying investment properties because they were never repaired or fixed or anything like that.
Right.
So.
Right.
Well, Brad, thanks
I
so much
really
for being
enjoyed
here, man. I
Yeah, really
appreciate.
enjoyed it. I like, going back and forth, just keying people into a little bit of what we do, giving a peek
Yeah,
through the curtain, so to speak. Like I said, it's not the thrilling frontline type of work that some of you guys are doing out there, but it does play a role. It is important, and I
yeah,
always encourage people to, make sure you have an open line of communication with, your title people, with a couple of title people, because
yep,
issues are going to come up. If you're in this business long enough, you may, as I mentioned earlier, you may have 30 smooth deals, but issues are going to come up, and so
yep.
it's always easier to work through those if you're able to communicate, able to understand the issue, so you know how to kind of attack it and move forward.
Yeah, I say title issues are like low appraisals. They're gonna happen every once in a while, and you gotta know how to deal with it. So,
That's it.
um, everybody stay calm, keep a cool head. Let's work through this as a team, and everything usually works out. So, one
Everybody's
way or the other, one
direction.
way or the other. So. Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate you having you on. And if you guys want to reach out to Brad, I will drop his contact info in the description. If you want to reach out to him about title questions, you want to give him some business, I'm sure he'd really appreciate that. So
Over.
uh, I'll drop that in there. But man, thanks so much, and I look forward to doing it again.
Me too, Channing. Thank you.
Thank you.